August 27, 1945. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastated landscape of Honshu, Japan's main island. In the farming villages surrounding the industrial centers, the acrid smoke of recent B-29 raids still hung in the humid air like funeral shrouds. Mrs. Kimiko Tanaka pressed her face against the wooden shutters of her family's farmhouse, her weathered hands trembling as she watched the American bombers approach from the east. For months, these silver giants had brought nothing but fire and death. Today, she was certain, would be no different. The superfortresses flew low, lower than she had ever seen them. Their bomb bay doors hung open like the maws of mechanical dragons. Kimiko clutched her infant grandson closer to her chest and whispered prayers to her ancestors, preparing for the familiar whistle of falling bombs that would surely follow. But something was wrong. The sound that echoed across the rice paddies was different. Not the sharp scream of incendiaries, but the dull thud of heavy objects striking earth. And then, impossible as it seemed, came voices, shouting. Not in terror, but in joy. What Mrs. Tanaka witnessed on that humid August morning would shatter everything she had been taught about American demons and reshape her understanding of what mercy could look like in the darkest hours of human conflict. The falling objects were not bombs filled with fire, but canisters packed with food, medicine, and hope, dropped not to destroy, but to save the very enemies who had brutalized American prisoners for over 3 years. The story of Operation Swift Mercy began not in the strategic planning rooms of the Pentagon, but in the desperate calculations of survival made by men whose bodies had become walking skeletons. By August 1945, more than 27,000 American prisoners of war were scattered across 775 camps throughout the Japanese Empire, their locations often unknown even to Allied intelligence. These men had endured an average of 3 years in captivity, watching 1,107 of their comrades die from starvation, disease, and deliberate cruelty. The mortality rate among American POWs in Japanese hands exceeded 40%, nearly 4 times higher than those held in German camps. For the young American aviators preparing for Operation Swift Mercy, the mission represented something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. These were the same pilots who, just weeks earlier, had been dropping napalm and high explosives on Japanese cities. Many had lost close friends to Japanese anti-aircraft fire, or had witnessed the brutal treatment of captured airmen. Now they were being asked to risk their lives not to destroy, but to deliver sustenance to camps holding both American prisoners and their Japanese captors. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell of the 878th Bombardment Squadron expressed the conflicted feelings of many airmen when he wrote to his wife, "Yesterday, we burned their cities. Today we feed their starving. I don't pretend to understand the strange mathematics of war, but I know what orders look like, and these feel different. These feel like something a man could be proud of when this is all over." The Japanese civilians who witnessed these unprecedented mercy flights had been conditioned by years of propaganda to expect the worst from American forces. Government broadcasts had warned them that capture meant torture, rape, and death. Mothers told their children stories of American devils who ate Japanese babies. The approaching B-29s, known throughout Japan as B-san, Mr. B, had become symbols of apocalyptic destruction. When the superfortresses appeared over their villages in late August, most Japanese civilians prepared for their final moments, but the Japanese people were unprepared for what they actually witnessed. Instead of bombs, parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the azure sky. Instead of fire, came crates of food stamped with American Red Cross symbols. Instead of death, came life-giving supplies: canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and medical supplies. The psychological impact on Japanese observers was profound and immediate, Mrs. Tanaka later told American occupation forces that she initially thought the parachutes were some new form of psychological warfare, perhaps poison disguised as food, or booby-trapped supplies designed to kill anyone who touched them. She watched from her hiding place as emaciated prisoners, some barely recognizable as human beings, stumbled from nearby labor camps, to collect the falling supplies. What she saw next would haunt her for the rest of her life. American guards, dropped with the supplies, sharing their own rations with Japanese camp personnel who were themselves suffering from malnutrition. The scale of Operation Swift Mercy was staggering. From August 27th through September 20th, 1945, American B-17s and B-29s flew over 1,000 missions, dropping 4,500 tons of food, medicine, clothing, and other supplies to prison camps across Japan, Korea, Manchuria, and other occupied territories. The operation represented one of the largest humanitarian airlifts in military history, conducted while technically still at war with the recipients. For the Japanese civilians witnessing these supply drops, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. They had been taught that Americans were savage barbarians who showed no mercy to enemies. Yet, here were American pilots risking their lives to feed not only their own people, but their former captors as well. Many Japanese observers began to question everything they had been told about their enemies. Sergeant Hiroshi Yamamoto, a guard at the Omori camp near Tokyo, later testified at war crimes trials that he initially refused to believe the supply drops were genuine. "I thought it was some kind of trick," he recalled. "Why would they feed us after what we had done to their people? It made no sense according to everything we had been taught about American character. But the food was real. The medicine was real, and when I saw American medics treating Japanese guards who had collapsed from hunger, I began to understand that we had been lied to about many things. The symbolic power of food in this context cannot be overstated. In Japanese culture, the sharing of food represents one of the most fundamental expressions of human connection and care. For American pilots to drop not just the necessities of survival, but luxuries like chocolate and cigarettes, spoke to something deeper than mere military necessity. It represented a conscious choice to see former enemies as human beings deserving of compassion. The chocolate bars, packed in their distinctive brown wrappers, became particularly potent symbols of American abundance and generosity. Japanese children who had never tasted chocolate found these small squares of sweetness in the wreckage of supply crates that missed their intended targets. For many, it was their first tangible proof that the outside world contained wonders beyond their comprehension. Years later, elderly Japanese citizens would still speak of the chocolate that fell from the sky as a turning point in their understanding of their former enemies. But Operation Swift Mercy came at a terrible cost. 77 American airmen died during the operation, some from mechanical failures in their war-weary aircraft, others from crashes while flying at dangerously low altitudes to ensure accurate supply drops. These young men gave their lives not to destroy their enemies, but to save both friend and foe alike. Their sacrifice represented the highest ideals of military service: courage, compassion, and the willingness to risk everything for principles greater than revenge. The liberation of the Omori camp on August 29, 1945, became symbolic of the broader transformation taking place across Japan. Commander Harold Stassen, a former governor of Minnesota serving on Admiral Halsey's staff, led the naval rescue mission with a combination of military efficiency and humanitarian purpose that stunned Japanese observers. When the camp commandant protested that he had received no orders from Tokyo to release the prisoners, Stassen reportedly grabbed the man by his uniform and lifted him off the ground, declaring, "I have no need for orders from Tokyo to do what I want with these American prisoners." But it was what happened next that truly amazed Japanese witnesses. Instead of executing the guards or seeking immediate revenge for years of brutal treatment, American rescuers focused entirely on caring for the liberated prisoners and providing medical aid to anyone who needed it, including Japanese personnel. Emaciated POWs who weighed less than 80 pounds were carried aboard hospital ships, where they were bathed, clothed, fed, and given medical attention with a gentleness that many Japanese observers found incomprehensible. The transformation in Japanese perceptions was not universal or immediate, but it was profound. For every civilian who witnessed American compassion firsthand, Dozens more heard the stories from friends and neighbors. The image of chocolate bars falling from American bombers began to compete with the propaganda images of American devils. The sight of American medics treating Japanese patients challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about racial superiority and inferior enemies. Mrs. Tanaka would later tell her grandson about the day she realized that everything she had been taught about Americans might be wrong. I watched an American doctor, a man whose uniform was stained with the sweat of carrying supplies, stop to treat a Japanese guard who had collapsed from exhaustion. The doctor did not ask whether this man had been cruel to prisoners. He did not demand explanations or apologies. He simply saw a human being in need and acted to help. In that moment, I understood that kindness knows no nationality. The ripple effects of Operation Swift Mercy extended far beyond the prison camps themselves. Japanese civilians who witnessed the food drops began to question other aspects of government propaganda. If Americans were capable of such mercy toward former enemies, what else might they have been told that was untrue? The psychological foundation of Japanese resistance began to crumble, not through force of arms, but through demonstrations of unexpected human decency. The American pilots involved in Operation Swift Mercy faced their own psychological challenges. Many struggled with the transition from destroyers to deliverers, from agents of death to bearers of life. Captain Robert Henderson of the 509th Bombardment Group wrote in his diary, "It's strange to think that the same hands that armed atomic bombs are now packing chocolate bars for children. War makes philosophers of us all, but peace demands that we become something even more difficult, human beings again." The mission also challenged American assumptions about their enemies. Pilots who had been trained to see all Japanese as fanatical militarists found themselves dropping supplies to camps where Japanese guards were as emaciated and desperate as their American prisoners. The realization that suffering recognized no nationality forced many American servicemen to confront the complex realities of warfare and occupation. As the summer of 1945 drew to a close, the transformation of Japan from enemy to occupied territory was symbolized not by conquering armies or destroyed cities, but by the simple act of sharing food. The chocolate bars that fell from American bombers became seeds of a new relationship between former enemies. Japanese children who had been taught to fear American devils instead learned to associate Americans with sweetness and abundance. The broader implications of Operation Swift Mercy extended well beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis. The operation demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, it was possible to choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. The American decision to feed former enemies before they had even formally surrendered sent a message about the kind of nation America intended to be in the post-war world. For Japanese civilians, the operation provided their first glimpse of American values in action rather than in propaganda. The sight of well-fed American pilots risking their lives to feed starving enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about national character and racial superiority. It suggested that the American concept of democracy might include revolutionary ideas about human dignity and universal compassion. The operation also foreshadowed the nature of the American occupation of Japan. Rather than the brutal subjugation that many Japanese expected, the occupation would be characterized by efforts to rebuild, reform, and reconcile. The chocolate bars and medicine that fell from American bombers in August 1945 were harbingers of the Marshall Plan mentality that would shape American foreign policy for decades to come. As autumn arrived in 1945, Mrs. Tanaka began to prepare her small plot of land for the next planting season. But her world had been fundamentally altered by what she had witnessed. The grandson she had held during those terrifying August days would grow up in a Japan where American soldiers handed out chocolate to children and helped rebuild schools and hospitals. The fear that had defined her relationship with the outside world had been replaced by something she had never expected to feel toward former enemies: gratitude. The transformation was not complete or universal. Many Japanese continued to harbor resentment and suspicion toward their occupiers. But for those who had witnessed Operation Swift Mercy firsthand, the falling supplies had carried more than food and medicine. They had carried proof that even enemies could choose to be generous, that even in war there could be room for mercy, and that the future might hold possibilities for reconciliation that seemed impossible in the darkest days of conflict. The chocolate bars wrapped in their brown paper became more than candy. They became symbols of American abundance, generosity, and the radical proposition that former enemies could become friends. For a nation that had been taught to expect destruction from American bombers, the gift of sweetness from the sky represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between East and West, between conqueror and conquered, between the military necessity of war and the moral imperatives of peace. In the decades that followed, Japan would become one of America's closest allies. The transformation would not be without difficulties or setbacks, but its foundation was laid in August 1945 when American pilots chose to deliver food instead of bombs, medicine instead of poison, and hope instead of despair. The terrified Japanese civilians who watched those first supply drops could never have imagined that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most successful reconciliations in human history. The legacy of Operation Swift Mercy reminds us that in the darkest moments of human conflict, individual choices can illuminate possibilities for redemption and reconciliation. The American pilots who flew those dangerous missions, the Japanese civilians who witnessed unexpected mercy, and the liberated prisoners who experienced salvation from the sky, all participated in a transformation that proved the human capacity for compassion could triumph over the human capacity for cruelty. The chocolate that fell from American bombers in August 1945 carried a message that would resonate across decades: that enemies need not remain enemies forever, that mercy is not weakness, but strength, and that sometimes the most profound victories are won not through force of arms but through simple acts of human kindness. In choosing to feed their former enemies, America chose the kind of nation it wanted to be, one that measured its strength not only by its capacity to destroy, but by its willingness to heal, rebuild, and reconcile with former foes. The terrified Japanese civilians who first saw those parachutes blossoming against the summer sky could never have imagined that they were witnessing seeds being planted for a future of friendship and cooperation. The chocolate bars, wrapped in brown paper, would become symbols not just of American abundance, but of the radical possibility that even the most bitter enemies could learn to trust, cooperate, and ultimately care for one another. In a world still struggling with the aftermath of humanity's most destructive conflict, Operation Swift Mercy stands as enduring proof that mercy itself can be the most powerful weapon of all.